Foundation Models for Embodied Decision-Making Agents, Part 22. This is a conversation between Albert Gu and the TWiML podcast. Sam Charrington. A shout out to Sam again. His podcast is really delivering almost episode by episode now a reaction by me, and the reason is because it's just so relevant. Everything he does, I think it's cutting edge and really important stuff, and he bridges academia with technology, which is exactly where we live at Orange Capital Partners. So Albert Gu, he's sort of in the 3DAO world, which is basically people that come from either electrical engineering and or theoretical comp sci. And what they're trying to do is think about, what actually is going on with these models that we call AI these days. Okay, what is going on with them? What is the opportunity? Why is it working? And once we understand all of these things, then the question, of course, comes up, okay, can we do better? Can we do better in terms of performance, efficiency? There's a couple more vectors here, like the usual stuff, energy efficiency, money, cost, things along those lines. This is very similar to Onur Mutlu's questions that he's asking as a computer architect. The difference is, of course, the people around Albert Gu, they come from the algorithmic side of things. So they don't think about hardware in a sense that they're not going to help you design a computer that does better based on its hardware. However, they will help you think about it, and then people who are good at this, so the Onur Mutlu types, will potentially design something which is driven by the work that Albert Gu is doing. And in that sense, it's very interesting because this is really computer architecture, the way Onur Mutlu talks about it in his inaugural lectures, where he explains the computer architecture is, on the one hand, bottom up. So you start with the metal and you go all the way up along the stack, all the way up to the algorithms, and then also down, top down, from the algorithms down to the metal. It's up, down, up, down. It's how can we improve each other? How can work that is done in certain parts of the stack help improve the totality of the stack? Because in the end, we're all interested in the result, which is we want to have a self-driving car. We want to have a robot that can walk around the factory floor and execute work. And the question is, how can we do that with the common hardware and software stacks available to us? And what Gu and his people are doing, they're kind of going almost back to the future, if you will, or maybe that's not the right word, but they're going back to what's called state-space model. And what they're saying is really, look, we started with, let's say, recurrent neural nets, so RNets, which is, think about it like that's how, let's say, traditional computer vision works. Like your car's driving, it has an understanding of its environment, and new data is coming in, and it's replacing the understanding of its environment adjusted for the new data. Now, how does it do this? Well, that's what the learning part of the model does, but it's constantly changing its representation of the environment based on new data. So this is, let's call it one extreme. The other extreme is the transformer architecture. Here, we have a representation of everything. Everything that the model saw during training is represented in a attention layer, or in actually many attention layers. What that does, it looks at how does the current data that's coming in relate to all the other data that the model has seen during training. And of course, also how does the new stuff relate to itself. So if I see a tree, how does that tree relate to what a tree is, and whether it's a normal thing, or maybe it's an unusual tree or whatever. Now, what the transformer architecture has given us is, of course, this unbelievable generality and this ability to semantically derive intelligence from the model, or all these excitements about intelligence, about semantics, about, like we've been talking about on this podcast a lot, about like the fundamental idea that we could potentially have a transformer-based self-driving model that knows what a building is through semantics, that understands that going behind the building and paying attention to kids, it understands all these things. And it does that because it has a transformer-based model with the kind of intelligence that transformers have shown to have. What Albert Gu is trying to say is, we can do this, but it's incredibly inefficient, because most of the time it's enough to just know there's a building. We don't need to really understand every time, what is this building? Is it a hospital? Should I expect an emergency vehicle to jump out of this hospital? All that kind of stuff. Like most of the time, and now let's relate this to humans, right? Look at us. Like, we walk down the street, we go to work. Aren't our lives very often sort of on what we call autopilot? And that just means we don't really need a hell of a lot of semantic understanding. We just, we go down the street, we get our Starbucks, we go to work, we say hi to our coworkers. Every now and then something unusual happens, and we need to really understand what's going on. I get approached by a beautiful lady. Oh, well, it looks like she's coming on to me, and I'm at work, and that's not a good idea. And there's potential problems with that. So I need to really use intelligence beyond just, let's call it state-based. Okay, this is data coming in, I just process it, I don't think too much about it. So in a very similar way, I'm sorry for using this example, by the way, I just popped up, and a lot of times this podcast is just me sort of thinking out loud and creating knowledge while I'm doing it. So anyway, we could use another example. We're driving in the desert. It's a Reno to Salt Lake City type Highway 80, and you're going 80 miles an hour straight, and then all of a sudden an animal is on the road, and well, you have to think, okay, what's this animal going to do? You have to absolutely use semantic understanding. You need to tap into your representation of the world, which is much deeper than just the sort of current state that's coming in. Now, fundamentally, I think what the question here is, and I want to paraphrase some of the things that Albert Gu said, which is very important. He says the most important question in any kind of AI model is, what data do we need to remember, and what data don't we need to remember? Now, this is, of course, a very tough question, because how do we know a priori what data we need to remember when we don't know what the situation is that we're going to encounter? And that, in my opinion, is an unanswerable question. Take FSD. I mean, what data do we need to remember for FSD? Well, I mean, we don't know. So how about we just remember all the driving data that we've ever seen? And then, okay, maybe we can have a gate, and this is kind of where Albert Gu is going. We can have maybe a learnable gate or some sort of discriminator that kicks out data from this compressed database, or let's call it a world model. I'm very careful with those words, because they mean different things to different academics, and sometimes I could be wrong. So I don't want to necessarily use the word world model, but it certainly looks to me like a world model, right? So I have a representation of the world, an understanding of the world that I've gathered through training. Let's take FSD. I've watched billions of miles of people driving, and I've learned what the world looks like based on all of that data that I've been trained on. And now new data comes in, and the question is, which data do I need to remember, and which data don't I need to remember? So there's potential of a hybrid solution where I could have a very big transformer-based representation of the world, or with several attention layers that collects that has been tokenized in such a way that I can represent the world pretty accurately and intelligently. So I can pull data, I can see a building, and I can, if I want to, even understand what the building is. Now this gate, this particular gate, this learned gate or this discriminator might actually tell me sometimes, you're on a highway driving from Reno to Salt Lake City. I don't think you need to access too much data here, so you don't need to load your memory with any kind of serious transformer based compressed model. You can just basically run a RNN, maybe have a little bit of context, but that's all you need. And then the discriminator is trained to understand, maybe sort of in a convolutional way. So when something unusual happens, defined as there's just a big delta between what's been coming in recently and what comes in now. In other words, there's an animal on the road, which hasn't been happening before. And now I want you to load a lot more data. I want to max out my high bandwidth memory or something along those lines to really understand what's going on. And because this has the shape of an animal, I want to particularly focus on things that are similar to animals. So I guess this is where the world is going. But even in Albert Gu's words, look, in the end, what we want is as much end-to-end trained, end-to-end, no structure whatsoever, as general as possible, and then we just run it. We have a world model which is as general as possible, because that gives us the most potential intelligence and semantic understanding of the world. The problem with that is, of course, again, it's a performance question, because if I have to compress the whole training data set into a world model, that is just expensive and difficult, and inference is very expensive. And that's the world where we live in. And I think that's why I like this podcast, this conversation between Albert Gu and Sam Harrington. It's because it helps you really understand what's going on. Again, what's going on is that we have to build a world model, and the question is, how much of that world model do we actually need? How much of the world do we need to remember? And it's very similar to humans. Like, we have a memory, and we have stuff in our memory that is incredibly powerful. My father is in his late 80s, and he still remembers things from his childhood, but then he doesn't remember stuff that maybe happened 10 years ago. Because I guess there is a certain structure, a certain hierarchy in our memory, a human memory, that controls for these things and optimizes energy usage and maybe capacity, and particularly, I guess with humans it's particularly, I would say, also compute. I mean, we just don't have the kind of capacity, the brain that can really work through all the possible connections. As Einstein said, we only use 10% of our brain. I mean, that's because we evolved that way. And now the question is, okay, why do we only use 10% of our brain? And the answer is probably, well, we use a lot more. It's just the 10% that we're aware of. So to summarize, I guess I want to say one more thing before I summarize. And that's really also a nice sort of segue into the first episode of today, which was sort of the introduction to me writing a story about this person that comes back from the future to change the trajectory of the Federal Reserve. And what I'm trying to say here is that I think I can actually use this conversation as an idea, as an inspiration, because this is what this hypothetical world will be exposed to, this world of sending people back from the future into the past. What they're going to do is basically have a world model and kind of like to Gen AI transform the person back into the world that was in the past. And then they have the same sort of problem, which is, okay, how much of the world do we need to remember, and how much state space can we actually just sort of run through? How much RNN type modeling can we run through? So very similar question. I'm obviously going to elaborate a little bit more, but again, I just wanted to put that in also for people to hopefully see the connection between what we do here and the way we think and the way sometimes thoughts evolve, which I just find fascinating. So to summarize, this is a reaction podcast to a conversation between Sam Harrington and Albert Gu. It's about state space models. It's about the idea that we can have sort of a new generation of transformer-based models that have a more optimized representation, a more optimized, compressed understanding of the world. That can happen through, let's say, discriminators that decide how much of the world we actually need to remember at any given time. Or we can also, another thing that actually Albert talks about is the tokenization, which of course is absolutely key. Tokenization is really the process of representing the world. What kind of tokens are we going to use? And that's something that Karpati has made a video about, so I think it's incredibly important. Think of tokenization as the question to how granular do we want to represent the world? What is the unit of representation? Is, let's say, in the world of large language models, we can go by word, we can go by letter, we can go by pixel. Of course, when we go into multimodal, we can ask even more fundamental questions, such as, well, should we just look at matter or even atoms or subatomic matter? Like, how far down of a granularity do we need in order to be able to generalize the best possible model? And the answer is, it depends. It depends on what we're trying to achieve. And I think that's what Albert Gu and his work are really going at. And I think that's why this whole episode that's what it's all about. It's, look, there is no one general AI. And I've said this many times. AGI, whoever talks about AGI is either stupid or a charlatan, because there's no such thing. There is only the kinds of intelligence that you need to solve a problem. So it starts with the problem and not with the AGI. There's no such thing as AGI. Now we go and solve all the problems. OpenAI has created GPT and then ChatGPT based on that to solve very specific problems, summarizing text, answering questions. It's a chatbot. It started out as a chatbot with Reddit and then morphed into what it is today. Now, there's some emergent factors, there's some ideas, some intelligence and all of that. But in the end, it's very specific to a very specific problem. And there's a fundamental question, of course, which is, can we actually even use this transformer architecture for other types of problems, such as, let's take, the example of multimodal self-driving. So is the transformer architecture actually the right architecture? And the answer is, it depends. Again, it depends. And I think it all starts with the tokenization. And the tokenization is the process of finding the unit of analysis. And when we say it's tokens per dollar, right? That's sort of the mantra in the commercial space. That's how you make money, is by maximizing tokens per dollar. Then you can also ask yourself, well, okay, fine, but it's really solutions per dollar, because you might need a lot of tokens. You might go very granular when it comes to maybe physics simulations. You have to go down to the subatomic level, maybe, or who knows? But we're not there yet anytime soon. But fundamentally, we have to ask ourselves then, okay, fine. If we go down that far into the granularity of things, we're going to need a lot of tokens per dollar. But then in the end, it's really solutions per dollar, because that's what the tokens are there for. And I think those kinds of questions and those types of attitudes are very, very important, particularly now that we are at a sort of a junction in the world of compute where, okay, well, we're going scale, large scale general models are the way to go. But do we really need subatomic level tokenization for self-driving? I would say no. But we might need it for space travel. So therefore, I think we have to start switching from tokens per dollar to solutions per dollar, and that's where this type of work, Albert Guin et al., really fits in really well. Now, whether we call it state space or transformer, those are just nomenclature. It doesn't really matter. What really matters is that we focus on the kinds of tokenization, or let's not even use that word. Let's just say, what is the unit of analysis that we're going to run the compute through? We can still use attention layers. Maybe that's the right attitude. What is an attention layer? It's just a sort of general form of a state space model. It just generalizes all kinds of possible states that these tokens can be in relationships with each other. That's all it does. And we could have, like I said, for example, we could have a hierarchical model where we literally tokenize the whole world into subatomic tokenization units, right? Let's say 20 years from now, we have quantum computing to the point where we can do that. We have the kind of compute power, and we can tap into several multiverses to use the kinds of compute and memory that is necessary for that kind of, But then when we do inference, we still won't tap into all of this compressed knowledge. When we do inference, we're going to have a gate or a discriminator that will tell us, okay, you just need these parts of the model versus those parts of the model. Now, of course, that calls for hierarchy, that calls for structure, and we just said we don't want that. So we're going to have to straddle this. This is an optimization problem, and Pareto optimality comes very often. You hear that word, and this is a very important word because it's a solution per dollar that we're going to be interested in going forward, and not just tokens per dollar. And this is what this work really morphs into, and that's why I think it's so important. Thank you.